Preface. The biography of Ken and Helen Wyborn, the story of a loving couple that created much and loved much. The story of the triumphs and happiness in a traditional family. The story of Ken Wyborn. Part 1. Childhood. Dad was born in 1924. He entered the world at an incredible time. His parents had spent their childhood at the turn of the century, and they had witnessed absolute change in the world. At the turn of the 20th century, the world was automated and empirical, and that automation and measurements of quantity and capacity ended in the most brutal of wars fought with the most brutal of intentions. The Great War ended in 1918, and my father was born into a world that was also decimated by the 1919 flu. To be born in the middle of the 20s was a blessing and a curse. Dad's father was an instrument maker, and his mother was a seamstress, only having a brief glimpse of the roaring 20s. When 1929 came around, all that stopped. Dad was in a tough world now, as all of those bankers and financiers that did so well in the roaring 20s either disappeared or exercised austerity on everybody else. My grandfather, being an instrument maker, meant he was a repair technician. In the Depression, the main trades that did well were repair. Not many could afford new items, but my father's father, Leslie Wyborn, was the salvation of his family. Leslie could fix a watch or a clock or an industrial instrument and make the components on his little instrument-making lathe. Dad was 11 when his mother died, so the year would have been 1935. So much hatred and upheaval was happening in Europe, and Dad needed his mum to comfort his worried mind. Dad's mother died of appendicitis. It was double tragedy because his father didn't know what to do to help, and his mother relied implicitly on the father. If someone died of appendicitis now, it would make headlines. Antibiotics were still not fully available, and surgery was a frightening prospect. Dad was a reflective boy. He used to smell his mother on her old clothes. He was very sad, but a joyfully mischievous kid, as you can see by the relationship he had with his brother. Extremely naughty and fearless. Ken Wyborn married a Christian woman, and he loved her faith and tolerated Christianity in his sons but blasphemed it at his death. Leslie Wyborn's elderly daughter had to take care of the family with her dad. She did all she could, but when she was older she went away. Nancy had a troubled life which was punctuated with extreme heartache. She did her best for siblings and her dad, but life was especially tough as it was the Depression leading up to a war. School and work. Dad went to Kogarah High. His brother Alan had gone there before him, and he was the dux of the school. Uncle Alan went onto the railways to become an engineer. As it was the Depression, it was incredible to succeed so well. He remained a powerful force in Dad's life. Dad didn't do as well academically, but he did very well at Latin. Dad loved Kogarah High, and he always told me that Clive James went to Kogarah High with great pride. Dad had a couple of jobs when he was a kid. One of the jobs, he ran a coal railway depot, which was complicated but not for Dad. Another job was cooking breakfast biscuits. Dad was worked off his feet, and he was tired and never got any rest. He really witnessed the hard labor of the industrial society, and he was not a fan. At Dad's 80th birthday, Dad's brother Percy told the story of Dad working at the biscuit factory. He said Dad would be standing at the oven, and he would have to stoke the oven with his left hand. Then he'd have to lift a tray of biscuits in and out of the oven and store them onto a rack with his right hand, and then he would have to reload another batch of biscuits with his right foot, and then he had to press the bellows for the fire with his left foot. Uncle Percy said that Ken was very good at that, and Ken suggested to his foreman overseer that if he was to stick a broom up his bum he'd be able to sweep the floor as well. Dad had a lot of talents, most of them linguistical, and what is going to work in a practical joke. My father had a few one-liners that he lived his life by, and one of them was bullshit baffles brains. It may sound wrong, but he was able to walk through just about anything in life with it. I'm not one for living my life by a couple of one-line rules. But Dad had to have his rules, and they served him well. If you stumbled across Immanuel Kant, he will say that you're a bad person if you don't tell the truth all the time and give anybody what they want if they asked for it. Dad knew about this, and he didn't agree with it. And if someone got upset because they were acting like a Kant, then that was their problem. The type of practical joke that Dad loved involved firecrackers and someone sitting on the outhouse toilet. It was in the late 30s when Dad was a naughty boy that he put so many firecrackers under the toilet that his uncle had to go to hospital with third burns. Another thing was to tie his brother to a tree and throw knives at the tree. Second World War. Dad was passionate that the world should be free with democratic systems of government. At the age of 17, Dad asked his father for permission to join the Air Force. His father, saddened and proud, gave his permission, not knowing the conditions Dad was going to fight in and the extent of the war that had to be fought. Every man has a battle with the world, and some people are idealistic and think the world can make sense. Ken Wyborn's undying belief in freedom caused him a great amount of trouble in his life, but he fought for it and won it, and in the process helped thousands of people with his love for people and justice and his engineering skills. At this stage, Dad was living in Bondi with his family. Dad was called Bluey, and he had blonde hair bleached by the surf. Dad loved the surfing life, but he was idealistic about this beautiful country of his, and he was brave enough to defend it. I say to people that the reason why we defeated Germany and Japan in the Second World War was solely because my father signed up. Dad was mobilized into the Air Force, and then he was put on the train and sent to Townsville. When he got to Brisbane, I believe he had some trouble with Americans because they were attracting all our women. Dad used to say that the Americans were overpaid, they were oversexed, and they were over here. There was a thing called the Battle of Brisbane, and Dad's train passed straight through it. When Dad got up to Townsville, he got on the ship and went to New Guinea. Then Dad was stationed at all different places such as Port Moresby, Goodenough Island, and Lae. Dad was a rebel, and he saw the war as he saw it. Many of his friends would die, but a lot of the time it seemed like there was a lot of waiting. Dad was electrically minded, and he was put in charge of the electrics of the camps. This was an important responsibility, and he was promoted to sergeant straight away. Dad struggled in the heat. He would get certain jobs and he would realize that they were past working on, so he would just throw them in the long grass. One time a Jeep came to him and he realized that the alternator was broken, and he threw that in the long grass too. The funny thing was, there was a name for a bloke up there who was struggling with the heat. It was Henry of the long grass, and just as Dad realized it, a fire went through the long grass and showed half a dozen things that were thrown in there because Dad didn't want to fix them, including a complete Jeep. Irony followed Dad throughout his life, and now it's with me. More often than not, irony is a bitch. He had his mother's wedding ring on his finger. He was rolling barrels on Goodenough Island, and one of the barrels must have caught the ring and rolled it. And it was lost forever. That was a significant event for Dad, and it shows his yearning for his mother in the cold, loveless world he was fighting for. Dad's commanding officer in Papua New Guinea was a tyrant, and all the men were broken down by him. He had given up on compassion, and he was not a good leader. Dad and 3 other of his friends wrapped him up in a tarpaulin and strung him to the top of the ceiling of the barracks. It was a dramatic event, as the man was furious. Dad didn't have any mates around him when he was in the Air Force, as he was himself called an odd bod. He had no fellow officer or airman he could call a real mate. Ken Wyborn had disdain for hierarchy, as you would if you were a mildly educated Aussie in the 20th century. He was not respectful to Douglas MacArthur on a visit, and was a little bit under his own command. Stuck with his Australian bully beef and I imagine some stray vegetables, my father broke into the American stores and he found the most incredible food that he had seen in his life. He would say to me, they had whole chickens in aspic, the avocados I had were the best I've ever had in my life, and the asparagus on toast was unbelievable. My dad had leave and he went home. He was a very real character, and his family didn't know how to take him. He sat at the family table and used the most filthy words you have ever heard, and explained his hatred of God. The time in Bondi Beach and at home with the family were almost painfully pleasurable. Dad went back to New Guinea. The war ended and then Dad was demobilized in Dubbo. The war was a long period of time for Dad and he was at a loose end. He knew that he would get free education at the university when he got back to normal life, and after he had demobilized he took the train to Sydney. On the train he sat with his friend Jaime that he met at Dubbo. Jaime was a soldier that was up in New Guinea with him, but their paths did not cross until they met at Dubbo. They both sat on the train and the train got in at Central Station, and the second train they took was to Bondi Junction. Dad thought it was odd that Jaime was on the train all the way to Bondi Junction. Then they both got on the bus and they both got off at Rose Street. Both of them lived in Rose Street about 300 feet apart, and had never met each other in their whole lives. Part 3. Young man. Dad had a new best friend and he had a new family and was very lucky to have survived the war, but he was rattled and a little bit bothered by it. Jaime proved to be a wonderful friend and his family owned a hardware store where the Coca-Cola sign is at King's Cross. They were friends for their whole lives and Jaime always wanted to make sure there was no anti-Semitism in our family. Dad met a girl by the name of Gwen Gosper. She was a ballet dancer and an Irish dancer. When Dad was dating her, all the friends and fellow workers of Gwen wanted to go for a trip up to Narrabeen for the day. Dad got in the car with all the female ballet dancers, and Jaime, with all his traditional bravado and almost psychotic sexual desire for women, was squeezed tentatively into a car full of the male ballet dancers. Somehow Dad arranged it and Jaime was not happy, but Dad thought it was a great joke. After Dad was demobilized, he didn't get much help after the war. The one thing he did receive was a free education at the University of New South Wales. He studied electrical engineering and he did really well. My father told me that he was one of those students that brought the high-tech into the classroom. The kit was the size of a suitcase. It was a tape recording machine almost as big as a small child. Ken Wyborn was one of those students that saw an opportunity to make a living before he got his degree, and he was keen to get out into the workforce. Dad could have been that student to finish his degree and apply to an engineering firm for a job, but looking at all his achievements in his life, that life would not have offered him anything. The opportunity that he saw was the use of fields in AC motors and generators. He realized that he could transform large factories that were driven by belts or by DC motors into a more efficient and safe AC alternating current. Dad had a vision of having his own business transforming factories, repairing motors and generators and transforming DC and belt-driven machines. When my father was in Germany, he learned a method of winding called the skein method. This method completely transformed the way a machine could be wound. My father brought it back to Australia, which gave him the advantage over any other motor Winding company. Starting out with a workshop in his house in Rose Street, Bondi, Dad was making more money than anybody he knew, and he was playing golf, and he was surfing, and he was socializing, and he was playing his music, where other people are told to work in an office and told to study accountancy at night time, and then when they finished at 8 o'clock they are told to work their second jobs. My dad enjoyed his life so much, and he may not have had superannuation, not unlike any micro-business owner, and he may not have been able to hand a lot of cash over to his children, but as far as providing an abundance of life and a wealth of happiness, my father didn't need to study accountancy at night. Dad and his brother were living the dream. They both had great jobs, and they both had heaps of friends, and were both part of the social scene in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Percy had wondered whether they should go overseas and see England and Europe. And when Dad heard the suggestion, he was going as soon as he could pay for the voyage. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision involving a lot of time and money and effort in organizing, and he made that choice on the spot, a characteristic that I have regrettably inherited. Dad had organized the trip and everything was going really well. He needed to sell his car to pay for other parts of the trip, such as accommodation and spending money, but the day before the Osova was about to sail, somebody drove into Dad's car and rode it off. Dad was devastated. The sale of the car was to raise the money. This crash had compromised his whole trip. My father and his brother sailed on the Osova and headed off to England. While on the boat, Dad and his brother wore tuxedos, had dinner, and drank cocktails and talked to the ladies. Part 4. Overseas. Dad and Percy arrived in England, a trip in a boat. I can't imagine how long it would have been and how expensive. When Dad got to London, they stayed at Charing Cross or one of those Aussie places where Aussies stay. Dad wanted to get a job straight away to help him pay his way. Dad got a job at Grace Brothers, where he was in the toy department, and he specialized in Hornby toy trains and all the accoutrements. Dad was again living the dream, and he couldn't believe how lucky he was to be in England, excelling at something that was a hobby of his. Walking the streets of London, he said to me that he knew what was around the next corner, and there it was, a streetscape that he had never seen before, burned into his mind from his past lives, or had he seen a picture in a book? Dad and Uncle Percy had seen a lot of London and saw a lot of the society in London, and were keen to have a trip around the UK before they went anywhere in Europe. They drove through England. They hired a Daimler which had camping equipment and cooking facilities in the boot. Dad and Uncle Percy never had to worry about meals. In their travels they went to Loch Ness. Dad said he saw a monster but had to look twice before he realized it was probably a double-humped camel that looked like Percy with seaweed on its head. Dad and Uncle Percy made their way to Europe. I believe they used the Bentley. Dad never really mentioned that. They went through France and Belgium and up to Denmark. Dad and Percy had met up with the miners. They all sat around and drank schnapps, drinking shot by shot, and Dad and Uncle Percy were matching them. Dad would look at Uncle Percy and think, geez, we can handle a drink better than these blokes. Then they all got up from the table, and Dad and Uncle Percy were concreted to their seats because they were so affected. Dad and Uncle Percy traveled through Europe. There's a great photo of Uncle Percy in an Austrian town. It was about this time they completely ran out of money, and they walked the streets of the Austrian town looking at the food in the windows. It was agony. They had nothing to buy anything with. They had their money wired to them from Australia. Ken Wyborn arrived back in Sydney. It was the early 60s, and Dad had learnt the skein winding method for quickly winding motors, generators and transformers. Ken Wyborn had a lease on life, and he was keen to make his mark on the world. Dad was the only choice for motor repair in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and he got all the work that he needed. He actually got so much work he had a drawer full of checks that he didn't have a chance to bank, and people would come to him and say, "Did you bank my check yet? Because I will be overdrawn if you bank it now." Dad was a creative man, and he wanted people to know how creative he was. His idea was to make a product that would make him go down in history as a great inventor. He tried out lots of ideas. Most of these ideas were hatched when he was married. Dad loved his golf, and he was a good player. He was a member of the Bonnie Doon Golf Club with his brother Percy. Dad had a jealous nature, and Percy had 2 holes in 1 recorded on the championship board, and Dad probably played more than he should have to get his name up on the board. Dad played the piano accordion in the band, and Uncle Percy played guitar. This was an awesome time in Dad's life, as everyone wanted to be friendly with him and his brother. Dad played some wonderful tunes for me when we were kids, and he was great on the piano. He loved his Beatles, and he loved his boogie woogie. Dad was good with the girls. From the loss of his mother to the selfishness of his ex-fiancée, he didn't expect friendship, comfort, intimacy, or love from any woman except the one that he dreamed about, a wife, in the traditional sense of the word. There was a dance as there was back in the day. Mum and Dad were in the hall, but they had never met. Dad was cheeky and naughty, and whether he was looking for a partner for his mate or just trying to get a rise out of Mum, Dad asked Mum for a dance. Mum said yes, and then Dad grabbed her arm and said, "Here is one over here." Mum grabbed Dad's arm and said, "I will dance with you, not him." Dad danced with Mum, and that is how they met. My father did what he was told, and Mum was acting in the way which he needed already. The story of Helen Wyborn. Born in 1932, in the Great Depression, my mother was blessed to have a professional father. He was a brilliant man. He was an electrical engineer, and he was at the forefront of alternating current transmission in South Australia. My mother's mother, Mary McEwen, was able to sustain the family as a matriarchal figure in the home and someone that could earn money with her talent as a concert pianist. My mother loved her town of Gawler, and her siblings were called the Gawler Rats. Mum and her brothers and sisters would have been in absolute heaven in a beautiful area of the world, and her mother and father were very noticeable people in the town. Mary McEwen was an incredible person. In her later life she was deaf, but she was still playing the piano with pitch perfection. My grandmother was able to play the piano at the theaters during the silent movies, and this was a very valuable income for the family. My grandfather, Cleland McEwen, was an electrical engineer and later on was to be a brigadier in the Australian Army. John was the oldest, then my mother Helen, then Elizabeth, then Brian, Robert, and then Mary. Mum had a wonderful relationship with her brothers and sisters in the way that they were all kept together by the same faith. My dad had borrowed money off Mum's family, and Dad was greatly loved, but our family had its distance. Mum loved South Australia, and she loved Gawler. Mum had aunties that were important to her and lived to a great age in this town. One auntie of hers was a Catholic nun, and she was a great inspiration for my mother. She lived into her late 90s. Mum and Dad and I were thinking of taking a trip down to South Australia and follow Mum's footsteps, but it never happened. I was worried about safety, but it would have been one of the nicest things I could have done for Mum. My grandmother and grandfather moved Helen, my mother, and her siblings to Melbourne, to a beautiful home that I was able to see for myself. Melbourne is the cultural capital of Australia, and Mum and my grandmother and her siblings were part of a social group. This was about the time of World War II, and my grandfather, Cleland, traveled overseas as a soldier. When war broke out in 1939, Cleland was in England at the time, and he was automatically drafted into the British Army and sent to do his training at Sandringham. My grandfather was distinguished, and he was offered command as a brigadier in Japan after the war. Because he was in England when war was declared, my grandfather was gone for all of the war, and my grandmother was beside herself with the responsibility of bringing up 6 children. The children and my grandmother moved to a certain town in Victoria. The idea of hiding the family there was to protect the children and my grandmother from spies and assassins, as Cleland's command was very important to Australia. Mum and her siblings had lots of fun through the town and the paddocks and rivers and creeks, but my grandmother found it very hard as there were no boarding schools in the area, and she was left to pretty much fend for herself with a full family. The little town was Nathalia, and Mum always had mixed emotions about the little town. Some of the townsfolk were rude to them, and Mum was always asking for her father. Mum would be drawn to tears whenever she talked about his memory. She loved him dearly and respected him. Maybe her choice for Dad reflected that, as both Ken and Cleland were electrical engineers. My wife and I made choices in a similar style, and I think that is good because I am like both her dads. When Mum was playing with Brian, her younger brother, he got his arm caught in the washing machine. He did some very serious damage to his arm, and he carried that injury for the rest of his life. Mum's sweet spot was Brian, and Mum loved him and respected him as highly as anybody in her life. Brian became a priest not long after leaving school, and he was a very successful priest. He would say masses for Hollywood stars and for people who followed older traditions of Catholicism. Mum and Dad had a period of separation, and 2 of my siblings and I lived with Uncle Brian in Yarrawonga for 3 months. We never really knew the truth of this situation. I think it was because Dad couldn't earn enough money. Brian was good to me as I was a bit shrewd when it comes to scary men with big priesty boots. My brother John was not so lucky when laughing at a Scrabble board that was on TV. 2 old ladies were playing. It was down the word mother and across the word fucker, and John was in hysterics laughing. Uncle Brian got out of his chair and kicked my brother right in the coccyx. Only now do I feel the despair of the poor little bugger. My mother's father came back from the war, and soon after he was offered a command in Japan. My grandmother Mary refused. She was fed up with caring for these kids, and she was worn out and at her wits' end. I believe there would have been heated discussions about this, but my grandfather capitulated as there was nothing else he could do. My grandfather eased his way back into civilian life. He started a master's in engineering and was working on a thesis. He spent a couple of years working on it, but my grandmother was frustrated. The McEwen move was made to Sydney in the late 40s, and all the children eventually found their towns. I believe all the children were happy with their homes. My mother made a great sacrifice to live with my father in the far north coast of New South Wales. They lived there as a loving couple that worked together for the benefit of the family. After they had established themselves in town, there was no better place for them to be. After living in Melbourne, Mum's family moved to Sydney. The children were split up, with the boys going to St. Joseph's of Hunters Hill and Mum and Elizabeth going to a boarding school at Strathfield. Although it has the alumni of any prestigious school, my mother and her sister were almost the only children there in this post-war period. When the family arrived in Sydney, Mum was still very young and her sister Elizabeth was noticeably younger. The boarding school was a cold, damp Dickensian place. It was a large set of buildings And the dormitory was cold and unsuitable for little children. My mother's grieving memory from this place was being separate from her little sister Elizabeth, who had a terrible cold. This cold seemed to last for months and months, and my mother could do nothing about it. The nuns were cold and heartless towards the idiosyncrasies of a child and didn't even realize that Elizabeth was suffering. These were not nice times for Mum, and she always reminisced in sad reflection. My mother did her nursing at St. Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. She loved St. Vincent's and she loved the vocation of nursing. Many calamities came through the doors of St. Vincent's Hospital, as it was the hospital for the eastern suburbs of Sydney. In the wild areas of King's Cross, she knew all about the prostitutes and pimps and madams and criminals and cutthroat gangs, but she felt safe being in a Catholic hospital that gave quality care to anybody. Mum ended up doing mothercraft. This was the third of her certificates in nursing. She was one person to take care of 20 little babies in the nursery. I believe all that crying affected Mum, as she would let you cry when you're a child, but she wouldn't let you whinge when you're a teenager, or complain as an adult. Mum was quite alone at this time, but I would imagine she had the warmth of the family. I believe her father had died by this time. There is a darkness in the explanation of this period to me from Mum. That whole area of Woolloomooloo is a dark area, and I don't believe that my mother blossomed until she went to Chicago, where she worked as a nurse in one of the biggest hospitals in the world. But she still loved St. Vincent's, and she had an awesome experience in one of the most dangerous parts of Australia, and felt the love and protection of God. Mum traveled to America and Canada with her sister and a friend. This was to be the greatest trip of her life, and she spent a lot of time in Calgary in Canada. Mum was very capable as a traveler and was able to take care of her sister and friend. While in America, my mother worked at the Chicago University Hospital. My mother fitted in perfectly. All her training in Australia was accepted in Chicago, and she was able to have a very comfortable life. They had a little kids program in the hospital, produced in their own TV studio. It was called Captain Kangaroo, and Mum got the job as the kangaroo. She was sort of famous in the hospital, but only for her voice. Mum was amazed at the ignorance of some Americans, as she was telling one doctor that she was from Australia, and he said, "No, you're from Austria." And she said, "No, I'm from Australia. It is a large continent in the southern hemisphere." And he said, "No, Austria is in the middle part of Europe." And they had a proper argument. The man went away still believing there was no place such as Australia. Mum met a man in Chicago, but she never talked about it, and Dad was insanely jealous. Dad used to call him Bubby, and Dad used to say all sorts of things Rosacea to annoy Mum about Bubby. One day he told me his name wasn't Bubby, it was Bud, and he was a doctor at the Chicago hospital. It fascinates me why a jealous partner attacks the other partner who is perfectly faithful. When Mum and her friends were finished in America, they had a trip to Europe where they drove a hire car to all the frequented places. They found themselves in Germany. My mother's friend thought it would be a fun idea to put a press sticker on the car. Later on that day, Mum came close to a checkpoint where she was arrested as an illegal press agent. Mum was actually put in a cell while her friends told the guards that it was just a joke. They came back to Australia through the Indian Ocean. Mum was coming to a place of quiet and subdued life compared to the vibrancy of America and Canada. When they were on the ship, they went through the Suez Canal, through the Indian Ocean, and through the Southern Ocean of Australia. My mother was very unfortunate to have travelled Through a massive storm in the Southern Ocean and the ship was listing about 45 degrees on either side, my mother hit a pane of glass and her whole face was cut as the glass shattered on her face. The ensuing infection caused acne and my mother only recovered. About 10 years later, this was her reintroduction to Australia, and she was patiently stoic in her love for Australia and yearning for a better life as per her imagination. The Health Board of New South Wales looked at my mother's experience and they said that she should start again. My mother had been away for more than 5 years, and when she came back she thought she could start her nursing again and get back on track and build a life for herself with her family in Sydney, but the Health Board of New South Wales didn't recognise any of the qualifications that my mother had received from Chicago, and all of her Australian qualifications had lapsed. This rule was an attempt to use nurses at a lower rate of pay that were fully qualified. They said to my mother, "You'll have to start again as a student nurse." Mum said, "No, that's not going to happen." Mum had a friend by the name of Jan Keith. She was a flibbertigibbet, Jan, and my mother decided to try out for the airlines as air hostesses, as both of them could not be nurses anymore in New South Wales. This was a glamorous career, and my mother was well-travelled and intelligent, and she was well suited to it. Mum got started on the airlines and she had some incredible experiences. One experience was when there was an explosive decompression on one of the planes and one of the air hostesses was ejected from the plane. Mum alluded to this happening while she was on the same plane, but I could never believe it, but I might as well just take her word for it. Another thing happened was there was a drunk passenger on the plane and he was harassing the air hostesses. Mum come up with a very good idea, which was to quietly tell the man that they were having problems with the starboard engine, and if he could keep his eye on it and tell her if it catches on fire. Another thing which was quite disturbing was when JFK was assassinated and some American Secret Service officers were on the plane, and they are all chuffed about how good that was. The very human or very disturbing thing that happened on the established route to Port Moresby was that one of the air hostesses got pregnant, and she was trying to maneuver the pilot into leaving his wife and starting a family with her. The hostess became more pregnant, and eventually when she had the baby, the pilot was in the hospital to see his child, but it had all the features of a traditional Papua New Guinea child and none of his features. Mum was a trendy smoker. I always imagined her with one perfectly held cigarette as she was reading a book. When it comes to my mum and gender politics and reproductive politics, she was very passionate. Gender politics for Mum emanated from the liberation theology movement, who have been trying to rewrite the Bible and its interpretation. She didn't like this because it wasn't generational truth and it was presented in such a way that it could not be discussed. Men were discounted out of the equation and looked upon as inherently evil, and women were encouraged to enter into relationships with themselves against their will and better judgment. This ideology blossomed in the 70s, which was the era of unbridled fornication, and Mum looked upon this whole movement and its offshoots at best as being weak on the ground. She was very compassionate towards people that identified themselves as non-hetero, and she recognized the truth of her church and her extensive understanding of a cruel world. Helen believed in the sanctity of life, and she would fight with everything she had to prove that if you had a gray area in defining life, then human nature will take advantage of that gray area and you will have a genocide. The gray area about the existence of a fetus was one great issue Mum had. She knew that if a fetus was defined as non-human, then abortion would be as common as any procedure in any hospital or clinic. The issue was not with a woman who found themselves in an intractable situation. The issue was human nature and invariably man's need to profit and capitalize on an opportunity, and in doing so push an ideology of death. She had the same argument for euthanasia, and she believed that if you gave an inch to the people that believe in the cessation of life, then life will be ceased in an uncontrollable manner. As seen in the Ukraine, men take great pleasure in the harm of civilians after philosophically justifying their violence. At the same time, she felt deeply for people who were suffering in their final days, and in her final days, the morphine brought her closer to her death in a humane and ethical way. She knew that young women were tempted by sex just like they are tempted by beautiful food, and she also knew that men can do some very terrible and deceiving things to have their way with young women. Mum's argument was discipline, and if a child could become an adult and be disciplined in that way, then all power to them, and if not, then the world has solutions and heaven will always forgive. Mum was a strong woman, and she was a modern woman, and she was swept along in the movement to separate men and women, and after her separation from my father he promised her the world, and that's what he gained when winning her back. Mum had misgivings about Dad, other women have misgivings of their husbands, and my love definitely has misgivings about me. When a couple grow old together, they can grow apart, and it probably happens when work takes one partner, or living arrangements change that don't suit one partner, or if one partner stays away from the house to avoid conflict. All three affected me for the sole reason that I couldn't provide for my family at the rate that I was going. I'm building myself up again, and I will be able to provide more and more as time goes by. Dad and Mum were an effective team. Dad was creative and industrious, and Mum was hard-working and was extremely intelligent. Dad liked his golf, but I don't know what Mum actually liked. I think, as many women, she was just hanging on for a family and hoping that her husband would step up. She wanted to be proud of her husband, and she wanted her children to play with her nieces and nephews. It was the early 60s, and Mum and Dad were newly married. In this time in her life she was focused on money, and one thing that Mum did which was awesome was starting her own business. This business is called the Easy Iron Out Service, and they did all the professional ironing for the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Mum and Dad had friends Harry and Dimmy, and together they ran this business. Harry and Dimmy would take the calls when Dad and Mum were on holidays. One person that they hated to receive a call from was a very rude man who seemed to be angry all the time, and his name was Chagrin. He would ring up and he would say, "It's Chagrin here, where are my shirts?" Harry Griffith was a famous Australian TV actor and movie actor, and he was a very proud and honourable man. Every time Chagrin would ring up, Harry would have another funny response for the standard outbursts. This was a lot of fun for Mum and Dad and Harry and Dimmy. Eventually Mum sold the service and relied on my father to provide an income. The service runs to this very day, almost 55 years later. When Mum and Dad met, Mum and Dad were at a dance together, but they had not been acquainted. There were plenty of people around and Dad was being naughty. Dad saw Mum and he said to her, "Would you like a dance?" And she said yes. He grabbed her arm raised in the air and said to his mate, "Here is one over here." Mum quickly pushed her arm down and said, "I will dance with you, not that man." And Mum forced Dad to dance with her, and that was the start of a beautiful friendship. Mum and Dad were to be engaged and married and lived together for 6 years before having their first child. Dad wasn't such a good catch, and I know that because I'm just like Dad, and I'm a rockfish. It's easy for me to sit here after the life of my father and call him a bad catch, because that's what some people think. but the fact about Dad was that he created his world, and he created it all the time. He was an intelligent man and an experienced man, and as I used to hear when a officious clerk would threaten him, my father was an amazing man and a successful man. Mum wanted Dad for all his differences and his naughtiness. She wanted him because she knew what the alternative was. A wealthy boy from a wealthy school trying to marry into a wealthy girl's family. Mum's father had died and all these boys disappeared because she was the daughter of a widow, but Dad truly loved Mum for who she was. Part 5. Ken and Helen. I never heard the story about Dad proposing to Mum. I don't know why it was a secret, but she had a beautiful engagement ring. Mum and Dad were married at the Bonnie Doon Golf Club, and Dad finally got his name on the wall as taking out the Cracker Night Cup. Dad's family were there and Auntie Alice was the matriarch of the Wyborn family. Mum has a big smile on her face in the photos, but you can see the trepidation and concern for the future, which was well-founded. Dad was a little bit blasé about his trophy that night, as it was always a joke between Dad's friends. When moving in with Dad, a surprise was the lady that lived next door. She was an old dragon who declared herself as the surrogate mother and protector of Dad and Percy. Her name was Mrs. Bias, and she hated Catholics. She said to Mum, "It's okay, dear, everybody is considered equal as long as they change. Not the type to save. I know this because I inadvertently follow his philosophy." My dad would receive large amounts of money frequently, and in the lead up to the actual acquisition of the cash or the bank deposit, Dad would have all that money spent not in an adherence to a budget, but very much in an adherence to Dad's likings. When Dad and Mum got married, they had their honeymoon at the Gold Coast. Dad thought it would be great for them to drive up in the Holden. Dad loved places like the Maya Lakes and Bulladila because it was great fishing there, and Dad used to take his girlfriends up there before he was married. They drove past Bulladila on their way to the Gold Coast, but there was a gem on the north coast of New South Wales. It was Yamba, and it was almost untouched, and even the bits that were touched were beautiful. Dad and Mum stayed there for a few days on the way to the Gold Coast, and guess what Dad did? Yes, he hired a boat and he went black fishing. He never caught so many beautiful fish in his life, and he threw them in Mum's lap as she sat on the boat thinking, this must be as good as it gets. Mum and Dad got to the Gold Coast, and then, not to be outdone in doing stuff for himself, entered a golfing competition. Dad had never played so well in his life, and if only he had have played that well at the Bonnie Doon Golf Club, he would have got on the board again next to the Cracker Night Cup. I don't know where Mum was, but I don't think she was being romanced the way she thought she was going to be. Dad was a very good man, and being engaged to Mum made him a better man, and being married to Mum made him one of the best men. Mum was a private nurse and Dad as a motor repairer and winch maker. They were happy. They were living in Sydney. They had the family around them, but they were waiting for something. Dad was playing golf one day, and he was talking to a doctor that had worked with Mum. He said, "We've got this little girl in the hospital," and that was the beginning of the family. Part 6. The Wheelchair Hoist. My father was ex-Australian Air Force from World War II. He was known Australia-wide for his electrical winches and his excellent motor winding abilities. Dad had worked on electric cars during the OPEC oil crisis, and he was doing what Elon Musk is doing now in the mid-70s. The only significant difference is the lithium battery and the aluminium chassis. When my father moved to Grafton, the idea was to supply winches for boats up to Brisbane all the way down to Sydney, and be somewhere in the middle where it was easy to transport things and install. This was working out really well, and Dad had a great reputation. One thing my father did after having knowledge of electric cars was to make golf buggies using the battery technology and the controller technology which he had developed. Dad made about 8 buggies for the Grafton golf course, and everything was pretty rosy. Until a shear pin broke on one of the motors on one of the golf buggies. Headlines in the next day's paper was a broken down golf buggy. It was surreal. A fellow World War II veteran was a heavy smoker and a double amputee. He had a brand new Ford Fairlane, and he would come to the left side of the car in his wheelchair, open the door, transfer into the passenger seat, transfer a bit more, then grab his wheelchair, fold it, and then drag it into the passenger side, and with a little rod he would close the door. Then he could drive anywhere he liked. He could go to Sydney, Tasmania, or even Perth. But he was going to have a bugger of a time with that wheelchair. The man only knew about what he was doing, and he said to Dad, "Can you help me get the wheelchair into the car with some sort of machine?" And Dad said, "The best way to do it is to put the wheelchair on the roof." Dad had made his wheelchair hoist, and it was very good. He was chuffed, and everyone around him thought that it was because of them, even the Milko. This was Dad's big break. My father always wanted to have a product to take to America. Dad did see dollar signs in the 52 states, and he wanted to be over there to make his millions. Dad was constantly developing the wheelchair hoist, and he was doing all he could to get ready for the big trip to America. Dad organized a trip to America with some help from Australia and the phone number of an Australian in San Diego. Bill Elford was a successful hotel-running businessman in San Diego. A public servant in Grafton had given Dad Bill's contact details and told Bill to expect Dad when he arrived in America. The Hotel Reventro was absolutely huge, and Bill was definitely a big deal. Dad and Bill got on really well as they spoke the same language. It was Dad's plan to go to Everest and Jennings. They were the largest wheelchair manufacturers in the world. Bill said to Dad, "I'll take you up there to Los Angeles and I'll sit in on the meeting and see how you go." Dad went to the meeting, and the executive said, "No, we can't do anything like that. You're a different market. We need to research the product. We need to do an engineering report and change our manufacturing." Bill heard all this, and he thought it was ridiculous that they wouldn't take my father on, and as the executive opened the door, Bill said, "Don't worry, Ken, I'll be able to help you out." Bill Elford organized an engineer and a workshop and organized the first run of the wheelchair hoist. They made 3,000 of them, which was a great result. Dad made great friends with the people that ran the engineering shop, and then had some amazing experiences in America. Mum and Dad had been married for a while now. It must have looked like it was Dad's big break. But when Dad went home, Bill Elford made sure that my mum came out the second time, because he knew that Dad needed Mum and he would fall down without her. When Dad got back to Australia, he didn't get much from his American deal, but he had a great experience, and he knew how important it was to have a family. Then it was the time of the big Western Australian corporate success, and we got wound up in it. These people came over in a Learjet and landed at the Grafton airport. They came to Dad's factory and offered him the world. They planned to make the wheelchair hoist in the big factory at Grafton, but nothing was done the right way. And it got ugly. It was a great battle between Dad and this company and someone that used to work for Dad. Dad won that battle and all the rights to his product. Part 7, Placid Waters. Living the life of my father found me in a metal shed working on products of his imagination, dreaming his dreams, waiting to be paid, and driving away to do installations. We were always on a shoestring. This was our life. With more than 100 inventions in his life, the big one was the wheelchair hoist, but the other one was the vacuum clothes dryer. The clothes dryer would take a full load of wet clothes and dry them in 15 minutes at room temperature. It was such a good idea that it bought a $500,000 house for our family. Dad had been working on the dryer for about 8 years, and when this group from Western Australia came over, they wanted the dryer for their prospectus. This invention from Dad and other inventions from other inventors made hundreds of millions of dollars for this company. We owned a house, but we lost the rights to the dryer before we moved into our house at Placid Waters. We lived at Junction Hill, which was our second time. It was nice for my siblings and I. We had many friends around the area. We used to go down the hill across the railway lines and down to the river. We would swim in the river, walk up to the farms, and would have a great time with all our friends. My oldest sister Mandy had all her friends at this stage, and we all used to go down to the river to swim. One day one of Mandy's friends came out with a big bite mark out of his boogie board. We didn't swim much in the river after that. My brother and I were walking along the train tracks, and we saw a massive bag of air that the railways must use for transporting pianos. It was about 16 foot long and 8 foot wide, and it was a real find. My brother and I walked it up to the house. We didn't know what to do with it, but the first thing we did was to put it in front of the trampoline. I was the younger brother, and I sat on the end of the bag, and my brother Mark jumped as high as he could on the trampoline and then landed on the other end of the bag. It launched me so high that I felt like I could see the top of a 3-story building. I went up and up, and my hands were paddling in the air, and then I came down. All I could imagine was what the ground was going to be like and how that would hurt, but luckily I landed on the bag. We called it the Burl bag, and our neighbors were half the size we were. Placid Waters was very different to Junction Hill. Although we had lived in Junction Hill on 2 occasions and we had plenty of friends there, Placid Waters was a dream house in a dream location. Moving to a 300-foot river frontage where there was a beautiful flat bit of land at the top of the hill that undulated down to the river. On that flat my dad built the most beautiful house. I was so proud of him, and I still am, because he wasn't the type to live on a worker's wage. Dad had sold the creation from his mind, and he had bought a $500,000 house. He had a stained glass window, he had a vaulted ceiling, a separate living area for him and Mum, he had an office, and he had 4 other bedrooms. He had a roundabout out the front and mowed lawns for 3 acres. He owned it absolutely outright, and at one stage, when the neighbors hadn't built yet, we had a 3-hole golf course. I believe I got the most out of it at Placid Waters because I landscaped a riverbank and made it special. Like my sister said, it was like Alice in Wonderland. Dad and I put in the wharf, and Dad made a 10-horsepower powered pontoon. I loved it, and I even used to see the Air Force check me out in the F-111s. We did lose that house at Placid Waters, but none of us had anything to be ashamed of. We lost it in a court battle, and the lawyers got all the money. We won the battle, and then we had a check to pay. Overdrafts just happened to be 18% at the time, and we had a bill that was ongoing as the court case was dragged out for more than a year. The overdraft paid the lawyer, and the bank took the house. We were devastated, but it was just another era in our lives. Dad's dream had been taken from him, but at least he lost it in a fight, and at least he lost it without fault. Ken Wyborn Products and Ideas. Dad was serious about all the products that he tried out, looking for the one that would make him millions. The product that he designed for a customer had a chance of being the big one, but in Australia we only sold 100 of them a year, and he was selling at $900 each. A list of items that Dad worked on are as follows: the bench grinder with drilling attachment, the trolley for the railways with one-way bearings, the little kiddies electric carts at the Lions Park in Sydney, the three-wheel disability scooter, the golf cart, the wheelchair hoist, the pull hoist, the sling hoist, and the bath hoist. My dad made many more machines than these, but are the ones that stick out the most to me. My father always made the product first and looked for the market later. My father had so much to give. He was bright and alive with enthusiasm and ideas, always inspiring people. My father lived to 85 comfortably. I made a break from him when I moved out of home when I was in my 30s, and Dad's commitment to an idea came back with a vengeance. In 2007, I always looked up to Dad for his brilliance and his kindness. He did use me quite a lot as his driver and person to get an occasional $10,000 loan to cover his expenses, and made me take the fall for his mistakes. Mum blamed me for all the money that I borrowed to pay for her car and Dad's bills. I used to spend $1,200 a year with my accountant, who did an excellent job on my profit and loss and balance sheet and would present it in a 20-page booklet. My mother, father, and wife never looked at the brilliant and hard-fought success that it described and never endeavored to understand how to read it. Then, assuming the worst, believed I was compromised as a person and businessman. There was a real romance between Dad and Mum. Mum said that she made a great sacrifice for Dad to leave her family and friends in Sydney. She made her choice, and she did commit herself to the support of Dad and our family. From the point where my father died until now has for me the highest of the highs and the time of greatest trial. In faith, hope and love I am wishing for a miracle in my own heart in order to be the man required to dedicate himself to his loved ones. Who are my loved ones? There's 4 of them and another 3 that I grew up with. Dad died of pancreatic cancer in 2009. He had all of us with him, and my brother John used to shower him, and I used to sit beside his bed and watch movies with him. He was very brave and only showed the stress and anger once, and that was because he was upset with what John and I believed. I think he only wanted to give us a bit of a kick in the pants. The funeral was at St. Patrick's in South Grafton, and it was chock-a-block with people, as well as crowding out the front of the church. Dad never gave me any constructive advice on how to treat women. He treated marriage with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but he was a loving husband, and he was kind, and he knew what he had to do in order to keep Mum happy.